On a freezing November night in Bakersfield, a 19-year-old girl with everything she owned in a torn backpack knelt beside a woman she'd never met, a woman bleeding on the pavement, while 40 people walked past and did nothing. What she didn't know was that the woman she was about to save wore a patch that meant something to 10,000 men across 3 states, and what those men would do when they found out would empty an entire town. But first, this girl was going to lose everything for a stranger. Before we go any further, I want to know something. Wherever you are in this great big country right now, whatever town, whatever back road, whatever quiet kitchen you're sitting in tonight, do me a favor and let me know down in the comments where you're watching from. Tell me your state, your city, your little corner of the map, because the story you're about to hear is one that reaches people from every place there is, and I want to see just how far this family of ours stretches tonight. And while you're down there, if you believe that a person's worth was never meant to be measured by what's in their pockets, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here, week after week, the ones the world overlooked and the ones who showed up for them anyway. Now, settle in, get comfortable, because what happened on a freezing November night in Bakersfield, between a homeless 19-year-old girl with nothing to her name and a dying woman whose secret would summon an army, is a story you are not going to forget. And it starts, like so many of the most important stories do, with a single choice, made by a single soul, that the whole world would have understood if she had simply walked away. She didn't walk away, and this is what happened because she didn't. The city of Fresno wakes up slow in the early cold, the kind of gray November morning where the light doesn't so much arrive as it seeps in, thin and reluctant, over the rooftops and the empty lots and the long stretches of cracked sidewalk that nobody bothers to fix anymore. And on one of those sidewalks, behind a diner that had been serving the same burnt coffee for 30 years, there was a girl, 19 years old, small in the way that people get small, when the world has spent a long time teaching them to take up as little room as possible. Her name was Delia. You would not have noticed her. That is the first thing you have to understand about Delia, because it matters more than anything else in this story. She had a way of moving through a place without leaving a ripple, of standing at the edge of a crowd like she was apologizing for being there at all. 6 months. That was how long she had been on the street by that November. 6 months since she turned 19. Since the state of California decided she was an adult now. Since the foster system that had carried her, imperfectly and coldly, since she was a child, simply opened its hands and let her fall. There is no ceremony for that. No one walks you to a door and wishes you well. One day you have a bed that belongs to someone else's rules, and the next day you have a garbage bag of clothes and the wide, indifferent morning. But here is what she was doing. That gray morning behind the diner, she was kneeling on the wet concrete, and she was feeding the cats. There were 4 of them, maybe 5, stray and half wild, the kind of thin, suspicious animals that most people shoo away with a stamp of the foot. Delia had saved a corner of the biscuit she'd been given the night before, a small folded thing wrapped in a napkin, tucked into her pocket like something precious, and she was breaking it into pieces with cold fingers and setting them down one by one on the ground, murmuring to the cats in a voice so soft you'd have had to stand right beside her to hear it, telling them it was all right, telling them to take their time, telling them nobody was going to hurt them here. Think about that for a moment. This was a girl who did not have enough to eat. This was a girl whose own stomach was empty, who did not know where the next meal was coming from, or whether it was coming at all. And she was giving part of what little she had to animals that could give her nothing back. Not gratitude, not company, not even a moment's warmth. She did it because something in her could not walk past a hungry thing and do nothing. That was simply who she was. It was stitched into her. Deeper than hunger, deeper than fear. She had almost nothing to her name. A thin jacket that wasn't warm enough. A torn backpack that held everything she owned in the world. And one thing more. One small thing she kept closer than all the rest. Around her neck, hidden under her collar where no one could see it, and no one could take it, there was a locket. It was old and worn, the little clasp of it gone soft with handling, the finish rubbed away at the edges from years of a thumb passing over it. It had belonged to a woman named Miss Ada. A foster mother Delia had lived with for 2 years when she was small. The one person in all those cold years who had ever looked at her like she was worth looking at. Miss Ada had passed away when Delia was 11, and the locket was all that was left. Delia touched it sometimes, without even knowing she was doing it. The way you press on a bruise to remind yourself it's still there. And the ache underneath all of it, the thing she carried heavier than the backpack, heavier than the cold, was a quiet and terrible belief. She believed that if she simply vanished one day, if she lay down somewhere and never got up, the world would go on exactly as it had before. No one would come looking. No one would notice the empty space where she used to be. She had grown so used to being invisible that she had started to believe invisibility was the truth of her, that she was a girl the world had already agreed to forget. She was wrong about that. She was so wrong. But she had no way of knowing it yet. Kneeling there in the gray light with the cats and the cold and the last of her biscuit gone. Before we go further, if you believe a person's worth isn't measured by what's in their pockets, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. The people who look down on folks like Delia, they're not here. This channel is for the ones who still believe in kindness. Let's find out who's with us. It was raining the night everything changed. Not the soft kind of rain that a person can walk through and hardly notice, but the hard, cold, driving rain of late November. The kind that comes down in sheets and finds every gap in your clothing and soaks you to the bone within minutes. The kind of rain that turns the streetlights into smears of yellow and makes the whole world feel like it's pressing in close and dark around you. And through that rain, head down, shoulders hunched, arms wrapped tight around herself, walked Delia. She was walking fast, faster than she usually let herself move, because that night she was racing something, and the something was the clock. There was a shelter on the far side of downtown, a low brick building run by a church, and it had exactly 40 beds and one iron rule. The doors closed at 9 o'clock, not 5 past, not 2 minutes after. 9, sharp, and whoever hadn't made it inside by then spent the night outside. And on a night like this one, outside was not a small thing. Outside, in that cold, in that rain, was the difference between a hard night and a dangerous one. Delia had missed the cutoff before. She knew what the rest of a night like that felt like, shivering in a doorway, watching her own breath, counting the hours until dawn. She was not going to miss it again. She had a little less than 20 minutes, and just under a mile to go, and she was moving as fast as her cold legs would carry her. And then she saw the woman. It was outside a pharmacy that had closed down months ago, its windows papered over, its sign dark. There, half collapsed against the wall and sliding slowly down toward the wet pavement, was a woman. Older, maybe in her 60s, gray hair plastered to her face by the rain. She had one hand pressed hard against the center of her chest, gripping at her own coat, and her mouth was open and working like she was trying to pull in air that wouldn't come. A paper pharmacy bag had fallen from her hand and split open in the gutter, and the rain was scattering little orange bottles of pills across the concrete, carrying them toward the storm drain one by one. The woman's eyes were wide. She was frightened. She was in trouble. Real trouble. The kind you can see from across a street. And here is the part of this story that I want you to sit with, because it tells you everything about the world Delia was living in. She was not the only one who saw. There were other people on that street. A small knot of them had gathered, the way people do, drawn to trouble the way they're drawn to a car crash. But not one of them was helping. One young man had his phone out, held up sideways, filming, getting it for later, for the internet, for the little hit of attention a stranger's worst moment might buy him. A couple stepped wide around the woman, around the puddle and the pills, hurrying on with their eyes fixed carefully forward, like if they didn't look at her she wouldn't be real. And a man in a heavy coat, passing close, glanced down at her and muttered something to the person beside him. "Probably drunk," he said, in the flat, dismissive voice of a man who has already decided that a stranger's suffering is not his problem. Probably drunk. And he kept walking. The woman was dying on the sidewalk, and the world was stepping around her like she was a puddle. Now Delia saw all of this in the space of a few seconds, and she felt the clock still ticking, still counting down toward 9 o'clock and the only warm bed she had. She knew, with a cold and practical certainty, that if she stopped, she would not make it. The math was simple, and it was merciless. To stop was to lose her shelter. To stop was to give up the one warm, dry, safe place waiting for her, and to trade it for a night in the rain, sick and shivering and alone. Nobody would have blamed her for walking on. Everyone else already had. She saw one thing more in those few seconds, though she barely registered it at the time. On the woman's chest, half hidden under the coat she was clutching, was a worn leather vest, and stitched onto that vest was a small patch. Faded, old, a little emblem that meant nothing to Delia, a girl who knew nothing of such things. She didn't think anything of it that night. She had no way of knowing that the small patch under that woman's hand was about to change the entire course of her life. She only saw a frightened old woman, alone in the rain, with no one stopping. And Delia stopped. She dropped to her knees on the wet concrete beside the woman, and in that single motion she gave up her bed for the night. Though she didn't stop to think of it that way. She wasn't thinking about the shelter anymore. She wasn't thinking about the clock, or the cold, or the long dark hours that were now certain to be hers. Something older and deeper than all of that had taken over. The same something that made her feed hungry cats with food she couldn't spare. She looked into the woman's frightened face, and she said the words that no one else on that street had bothered to say. She said, "I've got you. You're not alone. I'm right here." The woman couldn't answer. Her breath was coming in short, tearing gasps, her hands still clamped hard against her chest. And Delia, kneeling there in the rain, did the only thing she could think to do. Across the street there was a little corner market, its lights still on, and Delia ran to it and pushed through the door dripping wet and dug into her pocket for the only money she had in the world. $4. 4 crumpled, damp singles that were supposed to be tomorrow's food, the thin margin between her and going hungry. She spent all of it, right there, without a second's hesitation, on a bottle of water, and she pressed the rest into thinking clearly, because she knew the woman needed help bigger than water. She didn't have a phone. She'd sold it months ago, one of the last things to go, traded for a few nights indoors when the cold first came. So she looked, wild-eyed, up and down that rain-slicked street until she found it. An old payphone bolted to the wall outside the shuttered pharmacy, the kind of thing you hardly see anymore, the kind of thing most people walk past 1,000 times without ever really seeing. She ran to it, snatched up the receiver, and dialed the 3 numbers that everyone knows. And she stayed on that line, water running down her face, giving the address, describing the woman, saying, "Please hurry. Please. She can't breathe. Please come." Then she went back and she knelt down again, and she waited. And the woman's hand came off her own chest and found Delia's wrist and gripped it. Hard, harder than you'd think a person in that state could grip. Delia stayed. When the ambulance finally came, its lights turning the rain to red and blue, and the paramedics lifted the woman onto the gurney, that hand would not let go. The woman held onto Delia's wrist with a strength that came from somewhere past the pain, and her eyes, when they found Delia's face, were pleading. "Come with me, don't leave me." And so Delia climbed up into the back of that ambulance, a homeless girl with nothing but a soaked backpack and a bottle of water she'd bought with her last $4. And she rode along through the rain, holding the hand of a woman whose name she didn't even know. It was on that ride that the woman spoke. Just once. Her eyes fluttered, and she pulled weakly at Delia's wrist to draw her closer, and she whispered something, low and cracked, 4 words that Delia could barely hear over the engine and the rain. "They'll come," she said. "For you." And then her eyes closed, and the machines took over, and the paramedics moved Delia gently back against the wall of the ambulance. "They'll come for you." Delia didn't understand it. How could she? To her, in that moment, cold and frightened and out of her depth, it didn't sound like a promise. It sounded almost like a warning, like a threat, like she had stumbled into something she didn't understand and would somehow have to answer for. And that fear stayed with her through the long hours that followed, because when they reached the hospital, the woman was rushed away through doors Delia wasn't allowed to follow, and Delia was left behind. Left in a waiting room under the flat hum of fluorescent lights, soaked to the skin, shivering so hard her teeth chattered, with no bed to go back to, and no idea whether the woman would live or die. She sat there most of that night, alone, as she was always alone. And somewhere in those cold, small hours, a doubt began to creep in and settle over her. She had given up everything, her money, her warm bed, her safety, for a stranger. And what if it had been foolish? What if she'd made a terrible mistake, throwing away the little she had for a woman who might not even survive the night? A woman whose last words to her had sounded like a curse. Now, to understand what Delia had just stepped into, what that faded little patch on that woman's vest really meant, we have to stop here for a moment. We have to leave Delia in that cold waiting room and talk about the woman on the pavement. Because she wasn't just anyone. The woman on that pavement had a name, and in a certain world, across a certain stretch of California and well beyond it, that name was spoken the way you speak the name of someone holy. Her name was Ramona, but almost no one called her that. To the men and women who knew her, to the thousands of them scattered across chapters and states and decades, she was known by another name, one that had been given to her so long ago that its origins had passed into legend. They called her Mother Ram, and some of them, the oldest and the hardest of them, the ones with gray in their beards and 50 years of road behind them, simply called her Ma. To understand who she was, you have to understand what she meant. Ramona was the widow of a man who had been there at the very beginning, one of the founding members of a motorcycle club that had grown, over the long years, into something vast and legendary. Her husband had helped build it from nothing, from a handful of men and their machines into a brotherhood that stretched across the western half of the country. And through all of it, through every mile of that history, Ramona had been at his side. She was not a member in the way the men were. She was something else, something that in the world of that club carried a weight all its own. She was its matriarch, its heart, its queen. She was the woman the entire brotherhood loved and honored and protected, fiercely, without question, the way you protect the one irreplaceable thing you have. And she had earned that place. She had earned it over decades, not with leather or chrome, but with the 1,000 quiet acts that hold a family together. When a member's child was sick, it was Ramona who organized the meals, who sat in the hospital waiting rooms through the long nights. When a brother went to prison, it was Ramona who wrote the letters, who made sure his family didn't go without. She had a hand in every charity ride the club ever ran, the toy runs at Christmas that filled entire warehouses with gifts for children who had nothing, the fundraisers for the sick, the rides for the fallen. And when a brother died, and over the years many of them did, it was Ramona who held the whole thing together. She organized the funerals. She stood at the front. She held the widows while they wept. And she looked the grieving children in the eye, and she told them, "You are not alone. You will never be alone. This family has you now." She had buried more men than she could count, and she had made sure that not one of them was buried without honor, and not one of their families was left to fall through the cracks. That was who she was. A woman whom 10,000 hardened men would have laid down their lives for, without a moment's thought. A woman who, if she had so much as raised her voice and asked, could have summoned an army to her side within a day. So how, you might be asking, did a woman like that end up alone, dying on a rain-soaked sidewalk in front of a closed-down pharmacy, with strangers stepping around her and filming her on their phones? How does the queen of a brotherhood 10,000 strong end up with no one at all? The answer is one of the saddest and most human things in this whole story. Her husband had passed away. The great love of her life, the man she had ridden beside for 50 years, was gone. And when he went, something in Ramona pulled back from the world. Grief does that to people. It makes them retreat. And Ramona, for all her strength, for all the thousands who loved her, was proud. She had spent her entire life being the one who gave help, the one who showed up, the one others leaned on. She did not know how to be the one who needed it. She could not bring herself to pick up the phone and say, "I'm struggling, I'm alone, I'm not well, come and help me." That was not a sentence her mouth knew how to form. And so she had drifted, quietly, out of the daily life of the club she had helped to build. She lived alone. She kept her troubles to herself. She let the brotherhood go on believing that Mother Ram was fine, was strong as ever, needed nothing. Because the alternative, admitting weakness, admitting need, felt to her like a kind of betrayal of who she had always been. That is why she was alone that night, not because anyone had abandoned her. 10,000 people would have come running if they'd known. She was alone because she had hidden her needs so well that no one knew there was any need to answer. She had gone out that evening, by herself, to fill the prescriptions for a heart that was failing her, and her heart had failed her right there on the street, and there had been no one at all to catch her. No one, that is, except a 19-year-old homeless girl who had $4 to her name and gave every cent of it away. And here is the thing that Delia did not know. Sitting in that cold waiting room, shivering and full of doubt, wondering if she had thrown her whole night away on a stranger who might not survive. She did not know whose hand she had held in that ambulance. She did not know whose life she had refused to walk past. She thought she had saved a lonely old woman that nobody would miss. She had no idea, none whatsoever, that she had just saved the single most beloved woman in a family of thousands, and that somewhere out there, though not one of them knew it yet, was a brotherhood that would move heaven and earth for the woman whose wrist had gripped her own. She had lit a fuse that night, and she didn't even know it was burning. Ramona lived. Just barely, but she lived. Somewhere in the small hours of that long night, while Delia sat shivering in the waiting room, certain she had made a terrible mistake. The doctors did their work behind those doors she wasn't allowed to pass, and they brought Ramona back from the very edge of the cliff she'd been sliding over. It had been a heart attack, a severe one, the kind that does not give a person second chances. And when it was over, when Ramona was stabilized and the danger had passed, one of the doctors said the thing that would echo through everything that came after. He said that if help had come even 10 minutes later, there would have been no help to give. Another 10 minutes on that cold pavement, another 10 minutes of no one stopping, and Mother Ram would have been gone. 10 minutes. That was the entire margin. That was how thin the thread had been. And the only reason those 10 minutes hadn't run out, the only reason Ramona was breathing at all, was a 19-year-old girl who had given up her bed and her last $4 and refused to walk past. Delia didn't hear the doctor say it. She had waited most of the night, and near dawn a nurse had come out and told her, gently, that the woman was going to make it, that she was resting now, and Delia had felt something in her chest unknot just a little. She stayed long enough to be sure, and then, later that day, she did go in. Just once, just for a moment. She slipped into the room quietly, the way she did everything, and she stood at the edge of the bed and looked at the woman she'd saved, now hooked to soft machines, sleeping, small and gray against the white sheets. Delia didn't wake her. She didn't want anything from her. She just wanted to know that she was really all right, to see it with her own eyes. And then, having seen it, she did what Delia always did. She began to disappear. Because you have to understand how Delia saw herself, and how she saw a place like that. That hospital room, that woman, the whole world it seemed to belong to, felt to Delia like somewhere she had no right to be. She wasn't family, she wasn't anybody. In her own mind, she was just a homeless girl who had happened to be walking by, and now that the job was done, now that the woman was safe, the last thing she wanted was for anyone to think she was hanging around hoping for a reward. The thought of it made her burn with shame. She didn't want thanks, she didn't want money. She didn't feel she'd done anything that deserved either. She'd only done what any decent person should have done, what 40 other people that night had chosen not to. And so she left, quietly, without giving her full name, without leaving a way to find her, without asking for a single thing in return. She melted back out into the city, and back into her invisible life, and she told herself that was the end of it. But it was not the end of it. And here is where the world, which had already been so unkind to Delia, decided to be crueler still. While Delia had been sitting up all night in that waiting room, holding a stranger's life together, the clock she'd given up on had done exactly what she knew it would do. The shelter doors had closed at 9, sharp, and she had not been there. And it turned out that this had not been the first time. Over those long months on the street, there had been other nights she'd missed the cutoff. Nights the buses ran late, or the cold slowed her down, or life simply got in the way. The shelter had rules, and the rules had a limit. And this night, the night she'd spent saving Ramona's life, was the night she crossed it. When Delia went back, exhausted and hollowed out, hoping for a place to lie down and sleep at last, She was told that her name had been taken off the list. Too many missed curfews. She had used up her chances. There was nothing they could do. Sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the hardest turns in this entire story. Delia lost her place in the shelter system, lost even that thin, uncertain roof over her head, because she stopped to save a dying woman's life. The one night she was truly, genuinely, unarguably doing the most good a human being can do was the night that got her thrown out. She had traded her bed for a stranger's heartbeat, and the world had responded by taking away the bed for good. She was worse off now than she had been before she ever knelt down on that wet concrete. Fully on the street now, no list, no bed, no fallback, nothing. Punished, in the most direct and merciless way, for being the only good person on that corner. Let that sink in. Delia lost her bed for saving a stranger's life. If that makes your blood boil a little, good. Comment she deserved better below. I want to see how many of us refuse to live in a world where doing the right thing gets you punished. Trust me, it matters for what happens next. Because Delia thought she had walked away from that hospital and closed the door on the whole thing. She thought she was alone again, forgotten again, invisible again, just a homeless girl slipping back into the gray. She had no idea that in a hospital bed across town, a woman was about to wake up and start asking a question that 10,000 people were going to hear. A question that began with 3 simple words: who saved me? When Ramona woke fully, a day later, clear-eyed and lucid, the first thing she did was not thank the doctors, and it was not ask about her own condition. The first thing she did was ask about the girl. She remembered pieces of that night the way you remember a dream that's already dissolving. Fragments floating loose in the fog. The rain, the cold pavement, the terror of not being able to breathe, of feeling her own heart betray her, of watching people step around her and knowing, with a sinking certainty, that she was going to die alone on that street. And then, cutting through all of it, one thing she remembered clearly: a face, a young face, close to hers, framed by wet hair, and a voice, soft and steady, saying, "I've got you. You're not alone. I'm right here." A hand she had gripped so hard she thought she might break it. Someone who had climbed into that ambulance and held on and not let go. She didn't know who it was. That was what tormented her. She had a first name, or thought she did, half caught in the noise and the pain. And she had that face, that young, kind, exhausted face. That was all. And when the nurses told her, gently, that the girl had come by once to check on her, and then had gone, had left no last name, no phone number, no address, no way at all to find her, Ramona pushed herself up in that hospital bed, with the strength of a woman half her age, and said the words that would set everything in motion. Find her. She saved my life, and she vanished before I could even thank her. Find that girl, now. If you are going to ask 10,000 people to find one person, there are worse groups to ask than this one. Because this was a brotherhood built on exactly that kind of thing. This was a family that stretched across states, that had members in 100 towns, that knew the roads and the truck stops and the diners and the shelters, that could put word out and have it travel farther and faster than you might ever believe. And when Mother Ram asked them to find the girl who'd saved her, that word went out like fire through dry grass. Every chapter heard it, every member heard it. A young woman, homeless, on foot. A certain first name, a certain face. Check the shelters, check the soup kitchens, ask at the gas stations and the corner markets. Talk to the folks who live on the street. They see everything. They know everyone. Somebody knows this girl. Find her. And an entire network of hard, weathered, road-worn people, men and women the world crossed the street to avoid, quietly began combing a city for a 19-year-old nobody, not to harm her, but to thank her. And as they searched, they began to find things. Not the girl, not yet, but pieces of her, her story. They talked to shelter workers and case managers and the people who'd crossed her path, and slowly a picture came together, and it was a picture that stopped these hardened people in their tracks. They learned about the foster system, about a child passed from home to home, about the years of being nobodies and belonging nowhere. They learned about a foster mother named Miss Ada, The one person who had ever truly loved this girl, and how she had died when the girl was only 11, and how the girl had carried that loss ever since like a stone in her chest. They learned how she had aged out at 19, been let go by the state into nothing, been on the street for 6 long months, invisible to everyone, believing that if she vanished, no one would even notice. And then they learned the thing that broke them. Because in the course of asking around, in the course of talking to the other homeless kids who scraped by in that city, the club found out a secret about Delia that Delia had never told a soul. There was a spot, under an overpass, where a handful of homeless teenagers slept, kids even more lost and alone than she was. And Delia, this girl who never had enough to eat, who fed stray cats with the corner of her own biscuit, had been quietly, faithfully, night after night, leaving portions of what little food she managed to get at that spot. Not for glory, not for thanks. She never even told the kids it was her. She just left it and slipped away, so that someone hungrier than herself might eat. For months she had been doing this. This girl with nothing had been feeding others out of her nothing, in secret, expecting no reward. The same way she'd knelt down for Ramona. Do you see it now? Do you see what the club saw? They had gone looking for the girl who saved Mother Ram, and what they found was that she had been someone's Ramona all along. She had been quietly saving people this whole time. Saving the woman on the pavement wasn't a one-time act of a random passerby. It was simply who she was, all the way down, when nobody was watching and there was nothing in it for her. There is a moment I want to leave you with here. One of the members sent to gather information was an older man, a man who had been in this life for decades, a man with a gray beard and scarred hands, who had seen just about everything the road can show you. He was sitting across a table from a shelter worker, reading through what they'd pieced together about Delia's life, line by line. And the shelter worker later said that partway through, this big, weathered, frightening-looking man simply stopped. He set the papers down. And he couldn't speak. He'd buried brothers without crying. He couldn't get through this file. So now they knew who she was. Now they had her name, her face, her story, the whole aching shape of her life. What they did not have was the one thing that mattered most. They did not have her. Because by the time the club had pieced together who Delia was, Delia herself was gone. It's a bitter kind of irony, and the searchers felt it keenly. They had done the hard part. They had found out everything about a girl who had gone out of her way to leave no trace. But all of that information told them where Delia had been, not where she was now. And in the days that had passed since that night outside the pharmacy, the ground had shifted under her. Losing her spot in the shelter system had cut her loose from the one place anyone could reliably find her. Without that list, without that address, she had drifted, the way people on the street drift, moving from doorway to doorway, from one uncertain corner to the next, following warmth and safety wherever thin scraps of it could be found. The trail the club was following was already going cold, in every sense of that word. They'd arrive at a spot where she'd been seen and find she'd moved on. They'd get a lead from someone who'd talked to her a few days back, and by the time they got there, she was gone again. She was slipping through their fingers. This girl who had spent her whole life learning how not to be found. And then the weather turned. It came down out of the mountains the way it does that time of year. A hard, cold snap. The temperature dropping through the evening and into the night. Deeper and deeper. The kind of cold that isn't just uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous. The kind of cold that kills people who have nowhere to go. And somewhere out in that cold, unfound, unprotected, was Delia. She had gone to ground under an overpass, in the same rough, exposed kind of place where the homeless teens she'd been feeding slept, huddled into whatever she could find against the wind. And she was not well. The night in the rain, the hours soaked to the skin in that waiting room, the days on the street with no rest and not enough food, all of it had finally caught up to her body. She had gotten sick. She was running a fever, burning up and shivering at the same time, her strength draining away, growing weaker in exactly the kind of conditions where weakness turns quickly into something far worse. And this is the moment where the whole story tightened into a race. Because think about what was happening on both sides of it. On one side, an entire brotherhood, hundreds of people now fully mobilized, tearing through the city looking for a girl they were desperate to reach in time. And on the other side, that same girl, sick and alone and fading, out in a cold that was more than capable of taking her life. Exactly the way that cold pavement had nearly taken Ramona's. The parallel was not lost on anyone. They had a woman who had almost died, alone, because no one found her in time. And now they were staring down the very real possibility of the exact same thing happening to the girl who had saved her. That the cold would finish what the shelter's rules had started. That they would find Delia the way strangers had found Ramona. Too late, with only 10 minutes to spare, or worse, with no minutes at all. The fear of it drove them. Every hour that passed with Delia unfound was an hour the cold had her and they didn't. Time had become the enemy, and time was not on their side. And in the middle of all of it, in a hospital bed where she was supposed to be resting, recovering, staying still and quiet after a heart attack that had nearly killed her, Ramona was refusing to lie down. When she heard that Delia had been located near, then lost again, that the girl was out in the cold and possibly sick, something rose up in Ramona that no doctor's order could hold down. She wanted out. She wanted to be part of the search. She wanted to be there when they found her. The doctors told her no, absolutely not. She was in no condition. Her heart could not take the strain. She needed to stay in that bed. And Ramona, this proud, stubborn, iron-willed woman, looked at them and made it clear that they did not understand who they were dealing with. That girl had ridden through the cold and the rain for her, a total stranger, and given up everything she had. There was not a force on this earth that was going to keep Ramona lying safe and warm in a bed, while that same girl froze alone in the dark. She was coming. That was final. And here, at last, those 4 words come back around. Remember them? The words Ramona whispered in the ambulance. The words that frightened Delia, that sounded to her like a warning, like a threat. Like she'd stumbled into something she'd have to answer for. They'll come for you. Delia had heard those words and been afraid. But that's not what they were. They were never a threat. They were a promise. A dying woman, in the last clear moment before the darkness took her, looking into the face of the girl who refused to let her go, and promising her, with the last of her strength, that she would never be invisible again. That this time, someone would come. That this brotherhood, this family, would move heaven and earth to find her. Ramona hadn't been warning Delia. She'd been making a promise. And Mother Ram did not break promises. They found her. After all the searching, all the cold leads and near misses, all the hours of fear, it came down to 2 members who happened to be closest when the word came through. A tip, a sighting, a place to check, and they went, fast, out to an overpass on the edge of the city, where the wind cut through like a blade. And there, tucked into the shadows against the concrete, they found a girl, small, curled in on herself, burning with fever and shaking with cold at the same time, barely conscious, so weak she could hardly lift her head. They found Delia in almost exactly the condition Ramona had been in on that pavement, right at the edge, right at the place where a little more time would have meant no time at all. But they were not too late. They had beaten the cold. Just barely, the way Delia had beaten it for Ramona. But they had beaten it, and they wrapped her up and they got her to a hospital, gently, carefully, the way you carry something that matters more than anything in the world. When Delia woke, she did not understand where she was. There were clean sheets. There was warmth, real warmth, the kind she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. There were soft machines beeping somewhere near her head, and her first feeling, rising up through the fog and the fever, was not comfort. It was fear. Because in Delia's experience, when people came looking for her, when she was suddenly the center of attention, it meant something had gone wrong. It meant she was in trouble. Her tired, frightened mind reached for the only explanation it knew. She had done something. She was going to have to answer for something. She started to pull at the blankets, started to think about how to slip away, the way she always did, before whatever was coming could arrive. And then she saw the woman sitting beside her bed. It was Ramona, Mother Ram herself, who had defied every doctor's order, who had refused to stay in her own bed, who had been there waiting for the moment Delia opened her eyes. And for a long moment, the 2 of them simply looked at each other. The old woman and the girl, the one who had been saved and the one who had done the saving, meeting again at last, both of them pulled back from the same cold edge. Delia didn't understand. You could see it in her face. She looked at this woman and slowly, it came back to her. The rain, the pavement, the hand gripping her wrist. And she realized this was the woman she'd knelt down for. But she still didn't understand why she was here, why she'd been found, why any of this was happening. And so Ramona told her, quietly, gently, in that hospital room, she told Delia who she was. She told her about her husband, about the club, about the brotherhood that stretched across states, about what it had meant when word went out that someone had saved Mother Ram. She told her that hundreds of people had been searching for her, that they had learned her story, that they knew, now, everything she had quietly carried alone. And Delia, hearing all of this, began to cry. Not because she was happy, not yet, but because she could not make it fit inside herself. She had spent her whole life being nobody. She had spent 6 months believing that if she disappeared, no one would notice. And now she was being told that an entire family of thousands had turned the city upside down to find her. She kept shaking her head. She kept saying, "But I didn't do anything. I just stopped." Anyone would have stopped. She could not understand, could not begin to understand, why anyone would go to all this trouble for her. For her, a homeless girl with $4 and a torn backpack and a locket from a woman long dead. It didn't make sense. People didn't do that. Not for someone like her. And it was then that Ramona reached out and took her hand, the same way Delia had once taken hers. And she said the words that Delia would carry for the rest of her life. "You gave up your bed for a stranger," Ramona said. "Now you'll never sleep on the street again." Delia started to protest, started to say she couldn't accept that, and Ramona held her hand tighter and stopped her. "This isn't charity," she said. "Don't you dare think it's charity. You're not a stranger anymore. You're not alone anymore. This is family. Do you understand me? That's what this is. And family shows up." Here is the thing about a story like Delia's. It does not stay put. It does not stay contained inside one hospital room, or one chapter, or one city. Because while Delia had been recovering, while Ramona had been sitting at her bedside, the story of what this girl had done, and of who this girl was, had been traveling. It moved the way the best and truest stories move. Person to person, mouth to mouth, member to member, chapter to chapter, out across the roads in the States, farther than anyone could have planned or predicted. The homeless girl who gave her last $4 for a stranger. The girl who rode in the ambulance and wouldn't let go. The girl who, it turned out, had been secretly feeding other lost kids out of her own empty hands for months, expecting nothing, telling no one. That story caught fire, and it reached people who had never met Ramona. It reached people who had never set foot in her chapter, who lived hundreds of miles away, who had no connection to any of it except the connection that matters most, the simple human one. They heard about this girl, and something in them broke open. Hardened men who hadn't cried in years found themselves sitting quiet after they heard it. Women who had known their own hard roads heard Delia's story and saw pieces of themselves in it. People who the world had written off as dangerous, as frightening, as outsiders, heard about a 19-year-old who had been written off the very same way. And they decided, each of them, in their own hearts, that they were not going to let her go on believing she was invisible. Not while they had breath and a machine that ran. And so something began to organize itself. Something huge, a ride. Not a small thing, not one chapter turning out to shake a girl's hand, but a gathering on a scale that is hard to even picture. A ride to honor Delia. A ride to welcome her, formally, into the family, so that she would never again doubt that she belonged somewhere. And more than that, a ride with a purpose behind it. Because these were people who understood that love without action is just a nice feeling. They organized to give Delia a real future. A home of her own, a roof that no rule could take away from her. Money for school, for the education the world had never given her the chance at. A fresh start, a true one, the kind that could not be undone. They were not going to save her for one night and then send her back to the street. They were going to change the entire trajectory of her life. And they wanted her to see, with her own eyes, exactly how many people had shown up to do it. Delia knew none of this. She was healing, getting stronger day by day, the fever long broken, color coming back into her face. And one day, when she was well enough, they told her there were some people outside who wanted to see her. That was all they said. Some people, they helped her up, and they walked her toward the doors. This girl who still could not quite believe any of it was real, who still, somewhere deep down, was braced for it all to be taken away. And then, before she even reached the doors, she heard it. It started low. A rumble, far off, so deep you felt it in your chest before you heard it in your ears. And then it grew. It built and it built, rolling toward her like weather, like thunder, that started and simply would not stop, would not break, kept climbing louder and louder, until the very windows seemed to hum with it. Delia didn't understand what she was hearing. Her heart was pounding, and they walked her through the doors, out into the open air, and Delia stopped, because the world was gone. Everywhere she looked, in every direction, the streets had disappeared beneath an ocean of chrome and leather. Motorcycles, thousands upon thousands of them, farther than her eyes could follow, filling the road and the lots and every space there was to fill, stretching away until they vanished into the distance. 5,000 of them, 5,000 riders, sitting astride their machines, and as she stepped into view, they brought those engines up in a single, thunderous, rolling salute, a wall of sound that rose into the sky and shook the ground and washed over her like an ocean breaking. 5,000 people, and every single one of them was there for her. For her, Delia, the girl who had spent her whole life certain that no one would notice if she vanished. The girl who believed to her bones that she was nobody, that she was invisible, that the space she took up in the world was so small it might as well not exist. She stood there in the doorway, and she looked out at 5,000 souls who had ridden from all across the country, some of them for hundreds of miles, for no reason other than to tell her, with everything they had, that she mattered, that she was seen, that she was worth showing up for. And the sound of it, that thunder, was the sound of the whole world telling her that everything she had ever believed about herself was wrong. But the wave of it had not finished breaking over her, because as Delia stood there, overwhelmed, tears streaming down her face, her eyes moving across that impossible sea of people, they landed on something, on faces, faces she knew. Down near the front, among all those thousands of strangers, were young faces she recognized, the homeless teenagers, the kids from under the overpass, the ones she had been quietly feeding all those months, the ones she'd left food for and slipped away from, the ones who never even knew it was her. They were here. They were clean and warm, and here, standing among the family that had found them, because the club had gone looking for them too. When they'd learned what Delia had been doing in secret, they hadn't just come for her. They had gone and found every one of those kids, and brought them in, and started changing their lives as well. All of it, every bit of it, because of her. Do you understand what that means? Delia thought she had saved one woman on a rainy night, but that one act of kindness, and all the quiet ones before it, had rippled outward into something she could never have imagined. Dozens of lives, pulled back from the edge, all traced back to a girl who thought she had nothing to give. She hadn't just saved Ramona, she had started something. Something that was still spreading, right there in front of her, in the faces of children who would sleep warm that night because of who she was. And then Ramona was beside her again, and in her hands she held something small. It was the locket. Delia's locket, the worn old locket from Miss Ada, the one thing she owned that mattered. Its broken clasp that Delia had held together with hope for years. Only now it wasn't broken anymore. Ramona had taken it, quietly, and had it repaired, made whole again, the clasp mended, the finish restored. And when she pressed it into Delia's hands and Delia opened it, there was a photograph inside. A new one, not of the past, but of now. The club, the teens. This vast, unlikely, thunderous family that had come to claim her. And Ramona closed Delia's fingers around it and looked her in the eyes and said, "You're not alone anymore. You never will be." 40 people walked past Ramona that night and did nothing. 5,000 people rode hundreds of miles to make sure Delia knew she mattered. Which one do you want to be? If you're one of the 5,000, if you'd have stopped, comment "I would have stopped." And share this video with someone who still believes in people. Let's drown out every person who walked past. So what became of her, this girl who thought she was nobody? Today, Delia has a home, a real one, with a door that locks and a bed that is hers, and walls that no rule and no missed curfew can ever take away from her. She sleeps warm now. She sleeps safe. After 6 months on the street, after years of belonging nowhere and to no one, she finally has a place in this world that is simply, permanently hers. And she is back in school, studying, building the future that was stolen from her before it ever had a chance to begin, the future that a family of thousands decided she deserved. But more than the house, more than the schooling, is the thing that money could never have bought. She was taken in. The entire chapter claimed her as their own, folded her into the family so completely that she will never again have to wonder whether anyone would notice if she were gone. She has more people looking out for her now than most of us could count. The invisible girl has become one of the most cherished people in a brotherhood of thousands. And Ramona, Mother Ram, who nearly died alone on a cold sidewalk, recovered fully, her heart mended in more ways than one. She and Delia are almost never apart now. Ramona, who lost the great love of her life and pulled away from the world in her grief, found something in that girl she thought she'd never have again. She calls Delia the granddaughter she never had. And Delia, who lost the only mother she ever knew when she was 11 years old, who carried that woman's locket like a wound for all those years, finally has someone to look at her the way Miss Ada once did. They saved each other, in the end. The girl gave the woman back her life, and the woman gave the girl back her belonging. As for the others, the lost kids from under the overpass, the ones Delia had been feeding in secret, their story didn't end that day either. They were helped, some of them housed, all of them pulled in closer to safety than they had been in a very long time. And the ripple that Delia started keeps moving outward still, touching lives she will never even know about. Because that is what kindness does when you finally let it into the light. It does not stop, it spreads. And that is the thing I want you to take from all of this. We tend to believe that the people who change the world are the powerful ones, the rich ones, the ones with everything to give. But Delia had nothing. $4 and a torn backpack and a broken locket. She was, by every measure the world uses, the least of us. And it was her kindness, given from empty hands, expecting nothing, asking for nothing, that turned out to be the most powerful kind of all. Kindness from someone with nothing left to lose, given freely anyway, is a force stronger than we ever give it credit for. And here is the other truth, the one Delia proved with her whole life. No good act is ever really invisible. Not one. You may think no one is watching. You may think it disappears into the dark and means nothing. But it doesn't. It never does. She thought no one would notice if she disappeared. She was wrong. She was so wrong. Because the smallest kindness, from the person with the least to give, echoed loud enough to move 5,000 souls. If this story moved you, subscribe. Because every week we tell the stories of people the world overlooked, and the ones who showed up for them. And do one thing for me. Go be someone's 5,000 today. Even if all you can do is stop. Sometimes stopping is everything.